Hi, everyone. I'm John Williams. I am the Daily Books editor and a staff writer at the New York Times. And the Times is thrilled to be in its second year as a sponsor of the Edinburgh Book Festival. I was privileged enough to be there last year in person, hope to be there in person again in the future. But for now, we are equally thrilled to be coming to you from our libraries and bedrooms and living rooms with what I think is going to be an extraordinary panel with three remarkable writers who I will quickly introduce. And then we will, I'm sad that we only have less than an hour between us to talk about things, because I know that they would be capable of engaging you for much longer than that. Paul Mendez is coming to us from London. He is the author of Rainbow Milk, a debut novel that has been published to exceptional reviews in the UK and is coming out in the States next year. Maaza Mengiste is coming to us from New York. She is the author of her latest novel, is The Shadow King, the story of an exceptional woman at an exceptional time in history. And that book has been longlisted recently for the Booker Prize. Douglas Stuart is coming to us from New York Environs. And his book, his debut novel, Shaggy Bane, was also recently longlisted for the Booker Prize. So congratulations to both of you. And we're going to be talking today about a lot of things involving reading and writing and life as we know it now in this strange new time. But I thought what we would do is we would start, and I guess alphabetical order is as good a way as any, to let the authors introduce their most recent books. And in the case of both Paul and Douglas, these are debut novels, which makes them even more extraordinary, I think. And they will tell you a little bit about what their books are about so that we have the grounding in that. And then the four of us will start a wider conversation. So Paul, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Good to see you, and tell people a little bit about Rainbow Milk.
First of all, like alphabetical order, that means that Maaza, you and I will be next to each other on the bookshelves, which is fantastic.
I'll say hi to
you. Rainbow Milk is it's a novel in three stories, three generations of Black British people from the same family. Coming to the UK from Jamaica in the 1950s and experiencing racism, unexpected illness and disability, and sort of looking to the future to see sort of what it will hold for the children that they're raising here. And then it sort of flashes forward to the early 21st century, and a young 19-year-old sort of third generation Black British boy called Jesse, who is a Jehovah's Witness and a closet gay, who leaves the community behind and moves to London to explore his sexuality and creativity.
Maaza, hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see everyone. My novel, The Shadow King, is set in 1935. And it's really in the very, very early days of World War II. It involves, it begins with Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, which was actually happened in an attempt to colonize the country. And the story centers around the Ethiopian men and women who rose up to fight against the invading fascists. Through my research, I found bits of information about women who mobilized and joined the front lines to fight with men. And that becomes a central part of the book. And I focus on a young girl who's very poor, who's an orphan, who is a maid in the home of a nobleman and a noblewoman. And the nobleman is a commander of an army. And as the war begins, his wife begins to wonder, isn't this our country too? Shouldn't we be fighting with the men? What right do they have to defend the country and we don't? So she starts to mobilize her own women, and this maid, Hirut, joins her in that, and together they form an army that fights with men. But I was also really interested in what war looks like from the other side, and meaning the fascist side, the racist, misogynistic side. What does it mean to be that other person? And I have two characters that I tell the story through also, and one of them is an Italian Jewish photographer named Ettore. and also his commander, Carlo. I wanted to know what war was like from that perspective. How would they look at someone who looks like me? And so together, all those voices, and I use other different structures in the book, form this novel about this war.
Yeah, we'll get to some of those other structures and also some of the very, very ambitious antecedents to this book. Douglas, your debut novel, Shaggy Bane, in brief, is about a mother and son struggling and loving, but I'll let you take it from there.
Hi, everybody. Shaggy Bane, yes, as you say, is actually a love story between mother and son. It is a portrait of the Bane family, who are a proud working class family struggling to survive in 1980s Glasgow as the city is starting to sort of disintegrate around them under the Thatcher government. Agnes Bane is the mother of the family, and she's a beautiful, gregarious, generous, but a little bit proud woman. And she has actually married across sectarian lines. She's married a Protestant man called Shug. And as Shug starts to sort of philander his way, philander's too nice of a word for what he actually does, but as he philanders his way across the city, Agnes begins to slide into alcoholism. After Shug takes the family, Agnes and their 3 children, Catherine, Leek, and young Shuggy, who is the youngest, and moves them to a new house, a new council house in North Lanarkshire, he actually uses that as an opportunity to abandon them. As Agnes starts to sort of slide into her addiction and her alcoholism more, it's about really a portrait of how her 3 children come together to try and save their mother. Of all the 3 children, it's young Shuggy who stays by his mother's side the longest, but Shuggy is also sort of suffering under the patriarchy. He is a young queer boy who is deemed very quickly by those around him as not being right. And so really it's a portrait of these 2 souls struggling to survive.
That's great. Well, I have to say that the 3 of you, that was a tremendous job of summarizing very complex novels that we obviously recommend that you pick up and get to know these characters and their voices. They're very, each of these novels has what you would call a central character or 2 that are sort of the driving through line of the novel, but they're also very populous books. They, as you can tell, even from those brief descriptions, they have very wide worlds in them, and there are many people who you see both through the central characters and on their own terms. And so, but because there's so much of that, I don't want to, piece all of it together too much. I'm curious about the sense of place in each book, because it occurred to me that, just in the last day or two, that each of you has, whether it's direct autobiographical experience that's drawn on for the book, or maybe historical experience and family history. I'm curious if each of you could talk briefly about the ways in which writing about a place factors into the process in your work, and how sort of consciously you try to draw that the same way you might a character, and tell people a little bit about what specific place I'm talking about in each case. With your book, Paul, there are obviously, as you said, it shifts through generations, and so some of the place you get sort of secondhand through people's living with the experience still, Norman especially in the beginning of the book. But talk a little bit about the 1950s England that you start in, and then the more modern day.
Well, Norman is a member of what we now call the Windrush Generation. So a group of people mostly from the Caribbean who moved to the UK sort of from the late 40s to the early 1970s. And Britain's immigration laws changed several times during that time. So there was always a sense of difficulty attached to their presence, both from within the UK and from outside. But normally speaking, in 1959, from the Black country where I grew up. So he is in West Bromwich, Wolverhampton, and he is a manual labourer, or has been a gardener actually, but certain things have happened to him which mean that he can't sort of do that job anymore. And indeed, he is at home looking after his 2 very, very small children. And Norman, being a Jamaican man, being a very proud man, being a former boxer, is very much wondering sort of how things are going to pan out for him and for his 2 small children, especially Robert, who is 2 and a bit, and his tiny daughter Glory, who's 10 months old. And I really wanted to, first of all, that generation is dying. The Windrush obviously was one of many ships that brought West Indian and Caribbean immigrants over to the UK. But we sort of see that symbolic moment of 1948 with 492 men. Lord Kitchener singing "London is the place for me." We see that as the symbol of this new era starting, but that was 72 years ago and counting. 3 of my grandparents have passed on, so that's 3 ways of me being able to find out more about my heritage and my history gone. And I remember reading an interview that Bernardine Evaristo did, where she said that, once you've got a few facts about things, you can use fiction to sort of create the rest. And I've sort of used that artistic license in Rainbow to create Norman's story. So he is ostensibly based on my grandfather, but all I knew about him was that he was very tall. And when he moved to the UK, he started to suffer migraine headaches and blurred vision, which led to sight loss. And then he was packed off back to Jamaica because my grandmother couldn't look after him anymore. And so sort of creating this sort of sense of him being a gardener and being a horticulturalist and being very, very passionate about beauty, that was something that I decided would be right for Norman as a means of exploring, especially notions of what people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds are taught England is before they get here. It's all Jane Austen and Shakespeare, and this sense that England is an extension of Northanger Abbey or something, and then the stark reality of what they're faced when they move over here and find themselves doing industrial jobs, doing the jobs that other people don't want to do, being on the front line, as we use the phrase now. And also, the Black country isn't a place that we see very often in fiction, and especially from an outsider's perspective, sort of reporting on cultural difference. So it's just really interesting to pair people up, and why I've used vernacular accents throughout the book, just to show people sort of being true to themselves, but within a situation, place-based situation that isn't necessarily of their control. But then we move forward, obviously, with Jesse into more familiar territory in London.
Just to give a sense of the complexity of Paul's book, that is all of that interesting stuff about Norman and the Windrush Generation is all in the first 50 pages of the book, and then we get more after that. Douglas, I'm going to go to you next only because you also, I think that the London parts of Paul's book that we didn't quite get to, or which we'll get to later, are a bit more contemporary and a bit more autobiographical in terms of knowing the place firsthand. And I think, if I'm right, you also have a very sort of strong personal connection to the place you wrote about. So I'm curious about how you approach that.
Yeah, thank you. Shaggy Bane is set in Glasgow of the 80s, and I grew up in Glasgow as a poor queer kid that sort of moved, was born and raised in Sighthill and then moved throughout the East End and then the South Side. And so as much as Glasgow has formed me as a human being, it's so integral to the characters within Shaggy Bane. Glasgow's a beautiful city, as I know I'm talking to people in Edinburgh, but Glasgow's, my city in Scotland. And, it has many, many stratas. It has culture, it has education, but it is dominated by the working class, and that is who I am from. And so in the 1980s, Glasgow, it was an incredibly difficult time within the city. It was a time when the Thatcher government took unemployment across the country to about 14%. But in Glasgow specifically, being such an industrial city, it went to about 26 to 28%, and then it stayed there for a generation. And so I grew up where all the men that I knew were sort of unemployed and having actually to go overseas, maybe to South Africa or to other places in order to find employment and feed their children. And we know that when men struggle, it's women and children first that suffer within the families. And so Glasgow in that way was just, I wanted to sort of set that on the page and really show it from that perspective. There's so much really powerful writing from the west coast of Scotland, but as the sort of the gay son of a mother who actually lost her own battle with addiction, I just wanted to sort of like look at it through that lens, because we often think of industrial cities as belonging to men. And because I was raised by a single mother, I'd always known Glasgow as a women's city. You know, my entire universe was a young gay boy surrounded by, you know, really strong, really powerful women. And so that's really the angle I had wanted to sort of approach with it. But Glasgow within the book is a character. I mean, the book really does sweep across the city. We begin in Sighthill, we go all the way out to North Lanarkshire, we come back to the south side of Glasgow, but then we also look at it in many different sort of timeframes. We even go back to 1940s Glasgow. And it was just such an incredible time, but also an incredibly difficult time. And I think any time that sort of conflict arises in a city and people sort of start to struggle in that way is just, honest, good people start to struggle in that way, is just worthy of our attention.
Well, speaking of conflict, most explicitly in Maaza's book, the kind of conflict that we think of first probably is war. And you take us back to, as you said in the summary, 1935. And so I guess I'm wondering about how you both recreate that place and time, and also what it means to you personally to try to own history.
Yeah, you know, one of the first things I had to think about when trying to recreate 1935 is what would life have been like in Ethiopia, in the villages in 1935, which is a completely different reality than 1935 in the United States or in Europe. You know, life was completely different. Forget cell phones, you know, I was not very familiar with that. But here's another thing: Ethiopia and the area that I'm writing about is in the Northern Highlands, which is it's mountainous, it's very rough terrain. And so I understood from having looked at this war that part of what gave Ethiopia an advantage was this rocky, mountainous land that became really hard for Italians, as advanced as they were militarily, to get their tanks and all their artillery and all of their equipment and everything through this landscape. So the landscape was fundamental. It was in many ways a character in the book. It was a weapon of war for the Ethiopians, but then once the Italians got acclimated to the landscape, they used that also against Ethiopians. And I can get into that a little later, but I had to strip away all of these things that I thought I knew about what life might have been like. I mean, medicine, you know, there's just all these things. How did they treat wounds? How did they do these things? Ethiopians were barefoot. There's these little tiny details of recreating 1935 army. But, you know, one of my characters in this is an Italian photographer who brings his camera. And I was well aware that he's concerned with light. And one of the slogans of Ethiopia has been 13 months of sunshine. There's always sunshine. So he's accommodating this and how to take photographs of people with dark skin who wear white clothes, which is always this calibration. So I had these trappings that was the scaffoldings of what this world was. But, you know, I'm also dealing not only with war between two countries, but I was dealing with a system in Ethiopia that was very patriarchal and very much based on class and ethnicity. And how would I recreate that world where if you are born poor, you stay poor? There is just no sense of mobility. If you were born a woman, as one of my characters, the noblewoman tells the maid, Hirut, you know, you're born to fit into the world. The world was not made for you. Your mother understood it, and this is the lesson you have to learn. You're less than the dirt under my fingernail. And this young girl who then has to deal with sexual advances by her army commander, she starts to wonder, what is a country? If I'm supposed to be defending a country to keep myself free, and yet here's this man who's on my side who is starting to assault me, aren't I worth as much as a country? And so these kinds of questions, which, you know, I wanted to create that world of 1935, which felt, in some ways, the book took many, many years to write, but I was also writing this book during the beginnings of the Me Too era. And I was hearing these very interesting echoes. So as much as I felt like I was going back in time, in many ways, the world was starting to move into my writing. And then there were these really interesting parallels. But so in addition to the geographic landscape, there was also the emotional and societal landscapes that I was dealing with.
I feel like all three of you are making my job much too easy, because you keep sort of naturally going exactly to where I want to go next. But you mentioned Me Too, and that, I mean, it's, you know, it's an interesting thing to hear said in the context of, you know, 1930s Ethiopia and then Me Too. And there's this sort of sense of the present in fiction. And, you know, we've been living through, I think we were living through extraordinary times, you know, before this year, and now it feels like we're living through extraordinary times. And part of our remit here today, if there's much to say about it, is the ways in which fiction can or should deal with what is happening in its current moment. And even if it is, I think, Maaza, in your case, a matter of echoes and sort of resonances that carry across history. But I do want to start with Paul, because in another interview you did, you said that the novel does, quote, say a little bit about who we are as British people right now, and that Jesse's path, which he leaves behind his Jehovah's Witness family, which is obviously a very difficult thing to do on many levels. And you said that that could be a possible metaphor for Britain leaving the EU. And so I'm wondering, you know, how much of that was conscious, and how much you feel like when you sit down to write, you're worried about consciously addressing the moment as opposed to just letting it happen organically.
It's not a conscious decision, really. I guess, and all three of us on the panel can probably vouch for this, you know, being an intersectional person, you create stories wherever you go, and you're constantly responding to your environment wherever you are. And you're constantly responding to other people responding to your presence wherever you are as well. Yeah, I guess with Jesse sort of, so Jesse moved to London in 2002, just after 9/11, obviously, and you know, several months after being disfellowshipped from the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, and so unable to maintain contact with anyone he's ever grown up with, or, you know, his sense of family, his sense of extended family just gets cut off completely. So he has to sort of move to London to start a new life, and completely without a plan, and just hope that he meets people along the way who can help him. He's, you know, 19, 20 years old, knows nobody, is very naive, and you know, if I could shake him and say, like, you know, try to make a plan first before you do this. But yeah, it's a bit late for that now. And yeah, I sort of do feel like that's sort of what Britain's doing. You know, we don't know. I mean, you know, we've talked a little bit before the event started about you know, voting trends in this country, etc. And, you know, the election happened in December last year, when we didn't know that the coronavirus was going to sort of take such a sort of prevalent place in our lives this year. And so we voted for people who, as a nation, we voted for people who we thought were going to take us out of the EU, but actually what their inbox is, you know, that is all coronavirus, and maybe that now is Brexit. So, you know, again, we're sort of constantly sort of having to readjust ourselves to the situation. But with Jesse sort of growing up, we see him in his sort of mid-30s. You know, he hasn't really done anything particularly sort of spectacular with his life. He's still working in a restaurant. But he's in love, and he's found this sort of chosen family, which is wonderful for us to see. But that does not protect him from going to certain parts of the country where they're not used to a Black person walking through the market. You know, he's the only Black face there. The only other notions of African diaspora he sees are gollywogs for sale in antique shops, and, you know, little sort of Black slave ornaments, sort of, you know, wistfully chewing straw. And so he sort of becomes much more aware of his presence, and he feels like he's in England, but it's a very different England to that which he knows. And I think it's very important for people, especially with what's happened since my book has been published, with Black Lives Matter going straight back to the top of the agenda, and people sort of claiming not to understand that racism still exists. People need to see what it is like to be a Black person, a queer person, a woman, a person of an intersection that's different from being a heterosexual white male, and how their life is being dictated by heterosexual white males now who are in power. And I mean, you know, I chose a very sort of small way of being able to do that. But hopefully, yeah, the point sort of got across. But yeah, in terms of the metaphor for Brexit, that was one of the first interviews I ever did, and I don't know that I knew what I was saying really, but it probably is true. Yeah.
You're also free to retract it. You know, I don't. it's not a quiz. You know, you can change it.
The internet's got it now. The internet never lies.
Right. Oh God. That's a whole other can of worms. I guess it's fair to say, based on your answer, that also, I guess it makes sense that sort of any intersectional story is at any time resonant, as long as conventionality reigns in this world, which will, you know, probably unfortunately be for a very long time. Douglas, you can get to that question too about resonance in terms of a moment, but also, is there anyone in your novel you wanted to shake, and or everybody? Who'd you want to talk some sense into?
I don't think I wanted to shake anybody specifically in the novel, because the novel really is a story about good people going through a really tough time. And so you want to sort of shake the world around them to come to their aid and their assistance. But the characters are doing the very best they can, I believe. You know, I didn't set out to write a political novel, but it is a deeply political novel. All I set out to do was tell this really intimate story of very real, very vulnerable people trying to survive in a really tough time in a city's history. And I'd actually thought it was a very specific book in that sense, because it's specific in terms of geography and specific also in terms of time. Glasgow is a city that has gone through a huge resurgence and is a very cultural place, although there are still people who have been left behind by that progress within the city. But what really struck me was the response to the book has been that it still intersects with things that are crucial in our world today. I mean, think about income disparity. Think about how 33% of children in the UK are still living below the poverty line. Think about, even in the States, the reception the book has had from the Ozarks through Detroit and all of these communities where employment sort of dries up and people are left with a poverty of hope, and so substance and addiction sweeps in. And so I'd never meant to sort of intersect with all of that. I'd meant to sort of just really write this as tender a portrait as I could about this family who are really trying their best to sort of hold it together, to save their mother, to save themselves, to build a better future. And yet what I've found since the book is published is it is a timeless story, which is fortunate and also super unfortunate, because I would really have liked to have seen us not be still, you know, we're looking at the exam results across the UK at the moment, how deprived kids are sort of marked down as an algorithm. And that's just another sort of political thing that the families are struggling with. And so it's crazy that the book still resonates in that way, because I thought I'd written something about a specific time and a specific place.
I do think a lot of the time that's how you resonate. Ironically, you drill down into something very, very specific, and then everyone can somehow see their experience in it somewhere, or someone's experience in it somewhere. Maaza, that's a different question for you a little bit, in my opinion, just because I feel like both in terms of going back historically, you're writing about a long time ago, but also you're involved in this research, which is a whole other hour-long conversation I would be fascinated to have with you. And so I'm curious about how you feel. I mean, you mentioned Me Too, but writing these kinds of things in a moment of its own hypercharged, divisive wars of different kinds, and going back in history, how much do you who's the Maaza who's sitting in 2020 while you're researching and writing this, and how does she interact with the person who's back in 1930s Ethiopia, learning about the photography angles and the light? That's a big question, but
Well, let me tell you about the time that they intersected. Speaking of, I started writing this book in 2010, and I joked with my friends that when I started this, we were a democracy. And as I kept moving through the book and the fascists, settling into Ethiopia, we had also were moving towards authoritarianism here in the United States. And it was really, I did a lot of work, and the research, yes, but I had been reading up on fascism. I had been following Mussolini's speeches. I was trying to understand from an Italian perspective, how is it possible that you can get an entire country to get behind a man who promotes violence against groups of people, who transports that violence to Libya first, and then into East Africa, eventually brings it back home to to deal with the anti-fascists and the partigiani in Italy. And how do you get these people to galvanize around him? I had these questions running through my head. And there was one moment, John, when it was during the presidential debates in 2016. I was doing research. I was writing the book, and Hillary Clinton was debating that night with Trump, and I had the debate on in a small video corner of my computer, and then on another side of my computer, I have Mussolini's speech up because I'm taking notes on this stuff. And at some point, I happened to move from Mussolini over here to the debates, and I swear to you that I see Mussolini and Trump making the same gestures on stage. And at that moment, I was about to fall out of my chair. And that level of resonance terrified me. And I think it's been really an interesting process writing this book, as I have seen the world and particularly this country change. I was deeply frightened in 2016, as soon as these, the news came out that he had won. And I think people thought my fear was exaggerated. But I had been living in 1935 for so long that I could understand the extent of what was about to come. But I do think at some point that imagination is sometimes incapable of wrapping around, levels of cruelty, as we have seen in the UK and in the United States and across different parts of the world. What I understood as I was writing this book, also, as the Me Too movement suddenly exploded everywhere, and here I'm writing about sexual assault and women used as women were seen as territory to be conquered as much as land was and is. This is always in the nature of war. And so as I'm working on this, all of a sudden, you had the Harvey Weinstein not trial, but the accusations coming out. All of a sudden, women are starting to speak up, and the resonance has just continued throughout this writing. But I have to say this, that even as disturbing as it was to see the echoes, everything in my research has always shown me, and my characters, I think, work through some of this, deal with this and enact some of this, is that these moments of courage that are transcendent, these moments of kindness that can sometimes demolish acts of cruelty, I've seen come up again and again in history. And I think we see them here now, these uprisings and protests that we've been witnessing. When you see a woman standing in front of a row of highly weaponized men, military, and tanks, that's a hero. It's not, that's the battlefront. We've moved it. It's happening now. I saw it in 35. I saw it in Italy with the anti-fascist movements, the partigiani fighting against Mussolini. We're seeing it now. So if there's anything also to take and think about with resonance is that these people existed back then, and these people exist now. And I'm, that at least that fills me with hope, as terrifying as things can be.
No, well, I'm glad you said that, partly because both in terms of our pregame discussion and now, it can be hard to find notes of hope. But it is nice to think that maybe some of these things that, as we've been talking about, sort of exist throughout history, some of the more negative things, that they're joined by other things that also recur and always exist throughout history, which is this sort of the opposite of those things. So Maaza, I'm going to stick with you for this because I just don't want anyone to get too comfortable with the order of things, keep you on your toes. But I think this will, unfortunately, I knew this was going to go quickly, and we have all these great questions piling up from the audience. So this might be the last thing I prompt you with, but we did want to talk about your reading lives, and I'm curious about, I wanted to do this as sort of a two-part thing, but I'm going to combine it, which is to talk a little bit about yourself as a reader in a kind of thumbnail biographical sketch kind of way, and maybe explain how that lifetime and more recent life as a reader led to, in some way, you're writing what you wrote in these books, if that makes any sense to you. And you don't have to address this person, Maaza, but before, when I talked about incredibly ambitious antecedents, I was referring to a little-known writer named Homer. But you can take the question anywhere you want.
Oh, Homer's my homie. Yeah, well, let's start with him, because I remember reading him as a high school student. Here's this girl that is from Africa and really shouldn't be able to relate to these Greek tragedies. And it was a high school teacher of mine that said, read this. And I remember when I read it, it was electrifying. And that's the thing that a story can do. That's the joy of reading. I was completely transported into this Homeric world, the Iliad. I have to say, I think the world is divided into two groups of people: those who like the Iliad and those who like the Odyssey. I don't know if the twain shall meet, but the Iliad for me.
I'm going to start a hashtag about this on Twitter. We'll settle this.
I think we should. I have done informal surveys. So far, I've been right. But the story of Achilles, this idea, the questions of dignity and courage, of kindness and compassion and friendship, which is what the Iliad is to me, held me riveted. And then there's also, as I grew older and as I continued to read the book, I started noticing the place of women in the Iliad and other Greek tragedies. But Homer, for me, established the possibilities of what a story could be, the way that voices would come in, the way perspectives would change. The way in Greek tragedies the chorus comes in was very much for me like the Ethiopian troubadours from the 30s, earlier, ancient griots that would sing history, talk about different battles or talk about achievements, births, affairs in a village. They let it all out. I wanted to convey that kind of structure in this book. So I've had that. But in terms of other books that I think made me the writer that I am, there's a book by a writer, Ama Ata Aidu, a Ghanaian writer, called Our Sister Killjoy. And when I read that book, it probably echoed for me the similar, something that Homer had done. And what she does is, in addition to story, she was breaking form. And there were moments of just sheer poetry in that book. And I realized that there are ways to tell a story that don't have to be linear, that do not have to stick to one perspective, that can jump across different, maybe different genres. But another thing that has kept me very interested and active, and I guess an active participant in reading, meaning I'm reading, but I'm also taking notes and trying to understand the potential of the written word and what I am capable of. These writers have been those who have published and who have written under authoritarian regimes. And those, Ethiopians, but also writers from the Eastern Bloc. There's a writer from Croatia, Dasha Drindic, who passed away recently, that everyone should go read her books. Trieste was a masterpiece, but through her, I was then led to Danilo Kish, who's a Hungarian writer. But these writers who were writing when they were not supposed to be, who were writing about things that they should not have been. They're writing and every word that they're putting down is dangerous. I was curious about the way that language could swim between different meanings to actually land on something that's absolutely startling and subversive. So that has been a large part of my formation, and also just very quickly poetry. It's been that has kept me here.
Yeah, the way that all three of you write, I imagine you're all poetry readers, but and all appreciate brave writers, you know, of different ways. Paul, how about you?
Well, I suppose you know, I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and you know, so my childhood was absolutely dominated by the Bible, and which contains some poetry. But I suppose alongside that, and this only occurred to me the other day, all of my GCSE English syllabus and everything I'd read up to that point at school was all it was all books written by white men, and so, you know, going through secondary school, it was all sort of Shakespeare and Hardy and Tennessee Williams and F. Scott Fitzgerald, J.B. Priestley, etc., etc. And so I had sort of no sense of myself really. Well, I didn't see myself in literature at all. I didn't know that Black authors existed. I didn't know that Black male authors existed. And so, I mean, I haven't mentioned this, and maybe I should have at the top when you asked me what Rainbow Milk was about, but Jesse, when he moves to London, becomes a sex worker. And he sort of throws himself into all of these environments that he has never experienced before. And he wants to sort of, I guess, do something as close to breaking the law as possible, to sort of break himself out of this, this stronghold, this sort of moral stronghold, this kind of, this idea that he, as a Black male, is somehow wrong or somehow unliterary, or, you know, has nothing to contribute. And my reading reflected that in my early 20s. So, you know, I started to read people like Joris Karl Huysmans, whose novel Against Nature was published in 1884, and Oscar Wilde was a huge fan, and it was sort of this yellow book that is mentioned in Dorian Gray that is sort of very subversive and sends so many people off the straight and narrow. And someone sort of put that in my hands, saying, like, you know, this man also lost his center of gravity moving out of Parisian high society, because you know, he's the last of a dying old aristocratic French family, and, you know, he's too old now to sort of start a new family, to start a new legacy. But I mean, he doesn't want to move completely away from Paris, but he needs to move far enough away that he can sort of just exist in his own way. And I suppose I've been trying to do that ever since, really, through reading and through writing. You know, most of my writing up until the last couple of years, when I was challenged to write a novel, was life writing, just to sort of give myself a grounding, because, you know, A, I can't afford a shrink, and B, you know, I have the access to language to be able to chart the trajectory that my life has taken from being, you know, a devoted Jehovah's Witness. You have this sort of, like, you know, future of, you know, life on a paradise earth, you know, when all the evil is gone, to then, you know, obviously being a sex worker and, you know, going through sexual assault and all kinds of things that I just would never have predicted for myself. So yeah, I kind of read Proust, and that gave me a sense of, being able to say whatever I wanted and to think about whatever I wanted. And it doesn't matter like how long this sentence is or how like many clauses it has. It doesn't matter because it's my brain talking,
and to write
this
it
is very
from
useful. Exactly. And then I got over that quickly by reading shorter novels, but ended up discovering Baldwin as well. And I actually reread. So the first Baldwin novel I read was actually when I was 20. It was Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, which is his fourth novel from 1968. And I reread it 2 weeks ago. And it was so bizarre because I realized just how much Rainbow Milk takes from it and just how much my life was dictated by that. So this, I read it when I was 20. So I'd left the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I hadn't moved to London yet, hadn't engaged in sex work myself. I was in a very sort of impressionable place. And I sort of read that book, thought, wow, that's the first gay, queer protagonist I've ever read. Great. Pushed it aside, forgot about it, but it seeped into my subsoul to the extent that, I became a waiter, I became an actor, I did all of these things that Leo Proudhammer does. And I became an author eventually, like Baldwin himself. So it's kind of amazing, really, that we're still in a situation where young Black children aren't given the resources at school to learn what is most useful for them in life, to prepare them to be Black adults in this world and to learn about Black history and all of that. To that point, I'm very lucky because now I'm attending Goldsmiths, the MA in Black British Writing. So I'm actually sort of at the age of 38 playing catch up, learning Black history, learning about Black authors I've never heard of. Maaza, you were just mentioning a Croatian author who I've never heard of, and I'd be delighted to read her. But I'd never read anything by Buchi Emecheta before. I'd never read anything by Carol Phillips before, So I feel like, a lot of people take advantage of the fact that they're sort of studying sort of foundational texts at a young age, but really, who is it foundational for?
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily for me in terms of teaching me who I am and what it means to be a Black queer male in this world. Yeah. So my reading very much continues to influence what I write.
Douglas, I'm going to ask you to address that quickly, and then we're going to do a lightning round of reader questions because they're very smart. So what I'll ask you to do is you can answer that question, and then when I start asking reader questions, you can sort of raise your hand if you want to address something, but I don't think we'll have all three of you address each question.
I was a kid that grew up in a house without books, It was just the way it was in Glasgow in the East End in those days. The only books we had were maybe VHS tapes that were sort of wrapped in fake pleather, and you thought you were maybe reaching for Hardy and you ended up with 4 episodes of Dallas. And so, it was just really hard for kids to focus on books where I grew up. And, you need an awful lot of peace inside yourself and a lot of peace in your environment around you to be able to sit down and read a book. And especially for boys, boys like me, they were seen as incredibly feminine things. They contain thoughts and feelings, and that is certainly through that lens, it was always seen as something that was quite feminine. So books for me were not something that were a part of my life until I was about 17 or 18. I hadn't actually read that much. Like Paul said, I was sort of given a foundational education, but school was mostly a riot every day, and kids were dealing with so many things in the environment around them that they just couldn't focus. And so by the time like 300 kids started my high school, by the time 12 finished in the final year, just so many kids didn't make it to the end or had to go and deal with more sort of pressing things. I suddenly had a chance to sort of focus on books. And, the foundational education, even in Scotland, even for a white man, doesn't cover poverty or doesn't cover people that look and talk and sound and have urgent lives like yours are. And so I was still taking through these sort of huge classics that, whether it's Hardy or whether it's Golding, Golding puts kids on a plane. I hadn't even been on a bus outside of the city I grew up in. And so you can't relate. And so only when I became a young man and I had that sort of peace for myself, could I go and discover things that validated me as a human, but also spoke to me as a creative person. And so you have sort of Alan Warner with Morven Caller. You have my absolute favorite, Agnes Owens, with anything she wrote. But as a sort of mother of 7, a working class woman, sort of like bringing her voice to the page. You know, you have obviously Irvine Welsh, and you have Janice Galloway, who I adore, and George Friel. But it was so funny that I had to go and discover myself for myself instead of, I know the curriculum in Scotland has changed now, and we do celebrate Scottish writers, but when I was a kid in the 80s, that was not something that happened. I don't think our lives were deemed, I don't know, maybe you couldn't share them with kids. I don't know quite what it was. And so my entire sort of experience with books has been one of self-discovery, and also sort of like following writers through their journey. And of course, things like Thomas Hardy are huge, and actually really Jude the Obscure is hugely influential in Shaggy Bane, because we're looking at the sweep and sort of people sort of pushing against their station in life, against impending doom, I suppose you would say. But really it's been sort of formative Scottish writers for me that have really given me the courage to put my characters on the page.
Well, I will quickly, given that, I will point people to a YouTube clip where you had much more time to talk about some of those books, and I really enjoyed it in preparing for this. It's about 17 or 18 minutes where you talk about some of your favorite Scottish books, so go look for that. I'm going to start the lightning round. We'll go up right toward the end, and then I'll say a quick goodbye. We want to wring everything we can out of this talk, and the three of you are too interesting, which is why all this time has gone by. Linda W., I'm going to give this question to Maaza just because the other books, this is way too reductive, I know, but the other books are more autobiographical. So I want to ask Maaza a question. You bring such realism to your characters. Do you have their profiles laid out from the start, or do you prefer to let plot progression bring out their personalities?
Very good. I mean, very quickly, so we have time for other questions. I follow the characters. I don't define who they are at the beginning. I don't outline when I'm writing. I really follow them, and each new thing helps develop their characters. And of course, a lot of the character development and construction comes in revising, when you begin to understand the consequences of so much that's gone on, and you can develop that. You have hindsight once you start revising, but I follow the characters.
So it's not overly mapped out. Douglas, this is actually addressed to you, so I'll ask it to you. Lee S. asks, I would like to ask Douglas, did Agnes understand that Shuggy was gay? There's such a lovely tacit understanding between them. Does he think she knew, or was it just categorized in her brain under the same heading of just a bit no right?
That's a good question. Thank you. I think she did know. I don't think she necessarily had the ability to express it as gay or as homosexual, because I don't think that was seen as a fully fledged way to be in 1980s Glasgow. But I think she certainly understood that they were both outsiders struggling in this world. And as the book progresses and Agnes sinks into her isolation through alcoholism, Shuggy is also pushed inwards because the community around him rejects them. And so they're both sort of clinging to each other in that way. So I don't think she had the vocabulary to express it, but she certainly knew he was different.
Paul, I'm going to ask this question of you, although it definitely, if anyone else has anything to say, please join. But this person, Elaine O, writes, these books sound wonderful, and I'm impressed by your bearing witness to these various events and revealing them. Writers make us aware. However, I wonder how traumatic it was writing about painful things, and will we as readers get a sense of hope? The traumatic thing interested me because you talked earlier about not being able to afford a shrink, and I wonder, I think it's probably both, you know, a balm to you to write about this stuff, but also complicated in the way that can be.
That's a good question, because as I said earlier, I was engaged mostly in life writing, which, you know, I sort of collected enough material to sort of effectively have written a memoir. And that's what I sent to my now publisher, my now UK publisher, and she challenged me to turn it into a novel. So it became, you know, and sort of this ties into the previous question in terms of, you know, I created a lot of characters from scratch and let them do stuff, and let my central character, who is effectively an avatar of mine, drag him around. And then coming back to this question, it just became, therefore, a joy, because, you know, I am creating for the first time. I'm not just reopening old wounds and reliving situations that I want to leave behind, which is what I was doing before. And that's why I think that fiction is actually, memoir is harder to pull off than fiction, I think, in so many, you know, people think, you know, if they've been through something, that to write it as a memoir or as some kind of autobiography is kind of the way forward. Fiction is the way forward because it really releases you to be imaginative and to sort of be outside of yourself, and to watch yourself go into situations and to create new characters. I created Graham, you know, my dad's black. I created Graham as a white man, as an adoptive father to Jesse, to make a comment on Black masculinity as a sort of reflection of white masculinity, for example. So yeah, I mean, once I sort of decided that it was a novel and how much I was going to fictionalize it, the whole process became an absolute joy.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's a kind of freedom of action that there isn't always, especially when life is sort of battering you, you know, and you're not really always having choices. Very quick. So this is going to be very quick, Maaza, but I'm going to ask you this because it also includes Douglas and Paul in a way. Graham F. says, Maaza, I read a 2017 interview where you talked about how challenging it was to write a second novel. You succeeded wonderfully. What advice would you have for Paul and Douglas for their second novels? Let's just make it one piece of advice.
Don't give up. Don't give up.
Wow, is it that hard?
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah. Well, you know, there's always the curse they talk of that second novel. Don't listen to it. Do not listen to that.
That's a bit harrowing. Don't give up. You know, no matter how.
But I mean, you know, it's because you feel, especially if your book has been a success and you're moving into the next thing. I think the best thing I can say is don't copy yourself.
That's great. That's great. Well, you all wrote very successful debut novels. I should have mentioned earlier that Maaza's debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was a huge success as well. So we look forward to seeing the second from Paul and Douglas. We look forward to seeing the third from Maaza. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for tuning in from home, everyone. And we hope to see you in Edinburgh in person in the future. I'm John Williams again from the New York Times. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.